So welcome everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and pleased to be with you today for the virtual reading group. We're finishing The Origins of Totalitarianism today. We actually finished it last week. We finished reading the epilogue, which Arendt added to the second and all subsequent editions of The Origins. And so that was the end of reading The Origins of Totalitarianism. And it was exciting. I thought it was a great conversation last week. I thought the last few months talking about the book were excellent. Um, it is a book that many of us both love on its own, but also are thinking about the way in which it appeals to and helps us to understand the current world. I thought that we would add to our reading of the Origins some of the essays that Arendt wrote between 1952 and 1955. So I told you last week that the epilogue, which we read last week and which was added to the second edition, was written over a series of years between 1952 and 1955. And she wrote a number of letters to her friends saying, I wrote this book, but I don't think I ever really got to understand the nature of totalitarianism or the essence of totalitarianism. And I'm still trying to figure it out. And so in this period, she's traveling through Europe. She's talking about the book and she's writing a number of essays. Originally, she was thinking about many of these essays to be part of a new book, a book called The Modern Challenge to Tradition. And she imagined the ideology and terror essay, which is now the epilogue, which we read last week, as the central chapter of this book, The Modern Challenge to Tradition. She never finished that book, and she ended up publishing the epilogue as the epilogue. But a number of the other essays that were written in this period and were to either be parts of this book on the modern challenge to tradition or just essays are published now in an extraordinary book. I'll just show it to you. Hannah Arendt, The Modern Challenge to Tradition, Fragmente eines Buchs. So fragments from a book. It's volume 6 of the new Kritische Gesamtausgabe, or the complete critical works of Hannah Arendt, but it was the first one that came out, even though it's volume 6. And it really, I mean, a lot of the ones that have come out are very interesting. I'm not taking away from them, but in my reading, at least if you're interested in this aspect of Arendt on totalitarianism, this book is an exceptional and necessary addition to The Origins of Totalitarianism. And in it, there are a number of essays, again, written in this period between 1952, 53, 54, 55, in which Arendt is working through the questions of what is totalitarianism. I just wrote this book, right? The Origins of Totalitarianism. I talked about anti-Semitism. I talked about imperialism. I talked about racism. I talked about bureaucracy. I talked about the nation state. But she's really asking herself, well, what did I really figure out in writing this book? And a number of these essays are worth reading. There's one called From Hegel to Marx, which is an exceptional essay. Another on the impact of Marx. So she's writing a lot about Marx here. And you saw Marx and the reason she's interested in Marx emerge in the ideology and terror epilogue, right? She's interested in Marx as a Darwinian, as she says, as someone who comes to see comes to develop a scientific history, scientific laws of history that seek to impose or to have human history and human life follow knowable social scientific laws. In this case, the law of class warfare that will lead to the destruction of the bourgeoisie and the elevation of the proletariat. Just like for Darwin, there were laws that would lead to the overcoming of less human species, and eventually even the overcoming of the human species into some sort of transhumanism or something like that. And so Arendt is writing about these issues at this time, and they get incorporated into the final published version of Ideology and Terror. But she also publishes a number of other essays around this period, including Understanding and Politics, in various different versions. And so I asked you to read two of these essays. A lot of them are in German. And so I didn't ask you to read any of the ones in German, but two of the ones that are in English that I asked you to read. One was on Law and Power, which never was published anywhere. It's an essay that until this book came out, only existed in different typescripts in her files. And I found it to be an extremely rich and helpful essay in understanding the way she's thinking about these issues these days. And then I asked you to read part of Understanding in Politics, called On the Nature of Totalitarianism. On the Nature of Totalitarianism is published in many different places in Arendt's work. She published a version in the Review of Politics. There were other publications as well. And it also very much appears in as parts of it appear again in Ideology and Terror. All of these go together. What do I want to do today? I want to walk us through a little bit of some of the key ideas in these essays, but I'll try and keep it short and give you guys a chance then to ask questions about these particular essays, or the Ideology Terror, or the whole book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is what we're here to discuss. So at least in the version I have, which is in the Modern Challenge to Tradition, volume 6 of the critical edition, this essay begins on page 133. And it's in 3 parts. She begins by simply asking a question. And she says, many people say, right, that one cannot fight totalitarianism without understanding it, right? Now, this is an Arendtian kind of question. She says at the very beginning of The Origins that comprehension, right, is the attentive and unpremeditated facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be. She begins this book, right, in her preface, saying we need to comprehend and understand totalitarianism. We need to, we need to attentively face up to reality in all its horrors in order to then be able to resist reality. And now, really, a number of years later, thinking back on the book, she says, well, actually, to fight totalitarianism, to resist it, you don't need to understand it. She says, all you need in order to fight totalitarianism is to know one basic thing about it, which is that it's the most radical denial of freedom of any form of government. And that to mobilize people against totalitarianism, all you need to do is show them that that's the case, that totalitarianism is the most radical denial of freedom you can imagine. And she says, to do that, you don't need to understand it. All you need are examples of the way totalitarianism takes away people's freedom. And you can get that from just experience. And from the newspapers and from the lived experience and suffering of people under totalitarianism government. Um, and so she says you don't really need to understand it to resist it. She does say that moralizing, right? Trying to resist, and this is, I think, a very important point to consider, because I think it's a mistake that many people are making in their attempts to resist rising authoritarianism or tyranny or totalitarianism, depending on how you see it today. She says that moralizing will not work, right? Telling people that these new governments are going to commit crimes, that they are going to take away rights, are not going to work. Because she says we've had a breakdown of the whole structure of morality, right? This is the modern challenge to tradition. This is the crumbling of the pillars. And she says, in the end, people are flexible. People will not resist encroaching totalitarianism because on moral grounds. And so the only way to do it and to resist it is on grounds of, we're going to take away your freedom. That they might respond to. And that's a distinction she wants to hold on to. She then says that if you want to begin to understand totalitarianism as opposed to simply resisting it, we need to go further. We need to understand something doesn't mean studying it scientifically, doesn't mean defining statistics and researching sociological rules and finding causes and causality, right? All of these things are not what she means by understanding. And she writes about this in a number of her essays around this period. But what she wants to say is that understanding is an unending activity. It's not a scientific process of knowing a truth. It's not about knowledge. It's about thinking. And it's a way in which we try and come to understand and be at home in the world or reconcile ourselves to the world. It's an unending process. She says a number of things. One is that understanding seeks meaning, which we originate in the very process of living, insofar as we try to reconcile ourselves to what we do and suffer. So it's not about coming up with a knowledge of totalitarianism and facts and figures. It's about seeking the meaning of it. And thus it's about finding depth, understanding the way in which totalitarianism emerges out of who we are. In that sense, it's important to remember that we can only understand totalitarianism after it's over. And in doing so, we might seek analogies, but they're going to be inadequate. We have to understand it as a complete break in tradition, something new and original. And insofar as totalitarianism is something original and comes out of the world, the modern world in which we live, it's going to require a self-understanding. This is sort of the hard nut of what Arendt is after here. To understand totalitarianism is to understand something profound about ourselves, our need for totalitarianism, our openness to totalitarianism, why totalitarianism appeals to us today. And that's not a scientific project. It's a project of understanding. She says in order to move in that direction, we have to see that totalitarianism is a word that a name we give to our world, right? Um, that replaces an earlier word, which was imperialism. If imperialism stood for aggressiveness in foreign affairs and a lust for conquest, she says totalitarianism, which is the new central event of our modern era, stands for the lust for power and terror. The lust for power and terror. So we need to understand why it is that we have a lust for power and terror, whereas people in the 19th century had a lust for conquest and aggressiveness, right? And her understanding of totalitarianism, I mean, of imperialism, which we talked about months ago in the chapters on imperialism, is that there's a desire and a need to expand, to move beyond the nation state. And it comes both from economics, right? The need to constantly expand our growing economy, but also from a sense of a deep need to a dissatisfaction with the nation state, and a need to grow towards a kind of world domination, a lust for conquest that she sees profoundly in the imperialist era. We need to understand, therefore, where this new lust for power and lust for terror comes from. And she turns here in a strange way, but in a way that I think is important for her, to understanding both politics through both Immanuel Kant and Baron von Montesquieu. What Kant and Montesquieu both saw in a way is that if you try and label governments and say there are, okay, there are monarchies and there are tyrannies, there are aristocracies and oligarchies, there are polities and democracies, and they each have a different nature. Kant adds to this that there's a kind of way in which we can distinguish governments as governments that dominate and governments that are lawful, governments that are lawless and governments that are lawful. And this switch between lawfulness and lawlessness has worked for a long period of time. But she thinks it's a distinction that is, in a sense, upended by totalitarianism. And this is where her reading of Law and Power comes in and fits in with this reading of the nature of totalitarianism. For her, law and power are two conceptual pillars, right, of different forms of government. In one of these pillars, power is an instrument used to enforce the law, a means to bring about, the goal of lawfulness. And she says, in that kind of a understanding, it doesn't matter if the government is a monarchy or a democracy. In either case, it uses power to enforce its laws. But she says there's another kind of understanding of law and power, in which law is simply a limit on power, not a way to enforce, not power to enforce law, but law as a limit on power that is not to be overstepped. Law is thus a necessary evil to prevent the abuse of power. And in this sense, she says law is seen as a hedge or a wall surrounding powerful men who, without this limitation, might abuse their strength. And she says, now it does matter if we're in an aristocracy or a monarchy or a democracy. It matters greatly whether you're one man or a few men or the many who are permitted to use their power within the limitations of the law. Um, it matters if a tyrant is given power within the law or whether the people wield such power. Even in a monarchy, only one man is free to exercise power. Whereas in a democracy, many people exercise power, and law limits the power of those who rule. So for her, in this sense, um, uh, when you have a democracy, power protects all of us. If you have a monarchy, it protects the few. I mean, the one. And if you have an aristocracy, it protects the few. But power is now understood not as simply about enforcing the law, but it's a potentiality. It's something possible. It's a kind of action that needs plurality of men who live together on earth. And it comes into being between men whenever they act together and act in concert. And you see, this is the beginning of her lifelong interest in this idea of power, which she finds first in Baron von Montesquieu. For her, Montesquieu's great discovery is that power is divisible. Power can and must be divided to secure liberty, right? Famously, Montesquieu held up the English Constitution with the division of power between the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. And in the division of power into these three branches of government was for him a decisive criterion of truly Republican government. And for her, the key insight is not simply that power is divided, but more importantly, that power is completely separated from all connotations of violence. In fact, power is not about enforcing the law violently as a means to an end, but power is about my ability to act freely and thus to resist other people's power. Thus, power is not a means to an end, but is an act of self-government by all those who wield power. So there's two versions of power. One is as a means to an end, and one as a kind of self-actualization. And there's two versions of law. Law as a universal that needs power to enforce it, and law as a hedge or a wall that protects people in their own ability to exercise power. These are the ideas that she's developing in these essays, in this draft, Law and Power, and also in the essay on the nature of totalitarianism, which brings us and her back to the question of, okay, what is it that is the essence or nature of totalitarianism? She says, just like imperialism or monarchy or tyranny or democracy have particular authentic experiences that define them, right? What's the authentic experience of a Republican democracy? Well, it's going to be equality, and thus the equal power of all. What's the authentic experience of monarchy? It's going to be honor and distinction, that we're all distinct and different and need to be recognized in our social differences and thus our hierarchies. What is the authentic experience of totalitarian movements, right? And as we talked last week in reading it, the authentic experience of totalitarianism is going to be a kind of loneliness or impotence, a radical impotence. She actually says that that if you take the challenge and the underlying problem and the specific danger of Republican form of government is that when law breaks down, this is on page 150 in the nature of totalitarianism, when law breaks down, you're left with equals facing equals. And what Montesquieu says is when law breaks down, what breaks down is the public law that protects us from each other. What's left? Well, there's customs. Customs are still there and traditions. But he says customs and traditions won't last a long time. That's actually one of the, core insights that she talks about at the beginning of this chapter. The weakness of customs. So she'll say, as long as the customs remain intact, men as private individuals instinctively continue to behave according to certain patterns of morality, even though this morality has lost its fundament. Even if we lose laws, and the laws are challenged, and the laws are there's the downfall of laws and the decay of laws, you still have customs. But she says traditions or customs can be trusted to prevent the worst only for a limited time. If you don't have rich, legal, public life, customs will fade. And the result is that with the loss of law and the decay of law, and equals face equals, and the customs begin to break, to fade or decay, we're left with the impotence. Each of us feels impotent to act in ways that govern ourselves. And thus the result is fear and the will to dominate. And that's what she calls tyranny. We end up giving ourselves over to a tyrant out of fear. The tyrant is fearful of us, and we are fearful of the tyrant. That's the authentic experience of tyranny. But what is the authentic experience of totalitarianism? Right? Um, uh, it's going to be something much deeper than impotence. It's going to be loneliness. It's going to be a feeling of utter abandonment, of a sense of being without any purpose or meaning in the world. She says at one point in her Denktagebuch, on page 287, that understanding, and here we are with understanding, right? Understanding is the thinking of Einsamkeit, or solitude, right? Only in solitude do we have the capacity to understand, to come to understand the world and who we are in it at a time. Judging, she says, is the thinking of being together, whereas logical deduction is the thinking of being abandoned or loneliness. And we talked about this last week. To be abandoned, to be utterly lonely, gives yourself over to logical thinking, where you draw the most logical and extreme conclusions from any beginning premise. And this shows that totalitarianism is not lawless. It's a monstrous lawfulness. It's the realization of the law of an ideology or a movement. Its chief aim is to make possible that a particular premise, whether it be racial domination or the domination of the lower classes or the proletariat, is given free rein to apply itself and race through the history of mankind unhindered by spontaneous action. And this is what terror allows us to do. Is terror is lawfulness. I mean, this is one of the extraordinarily provocative and counterintuitive claims that she's making in these texts. Terror is not lawlessness, it's lawfulness. It is the full realization of the law of a movement or of an ideology, of some superhuman force or nature or history. Terror, thus, as we talked about last week, and now at this point, the end of this largely parallels the epilogue. Terror is the execution of the law of a movement whose ultimate goal is not the welfare of men or the interest of one man, but the fabrication of mankind. And it eliminates individuals for the sake of the species and sacrifices parts for the sake of the whole. Terror fits man into this iron band of terror. Total terror, she says, uses the old instrument of tyranny, but destroys at the same time also the lawless, fenceless wilderness of fear and suspicion, which tyranny leaves behind, right? Tyranny, which is based on fear, leaves people isolated. But at least in that isolation, there's a kind of small but meaningful freedom. It's a desert, but it's a desert um, uh, um, and it doesn't give a real meaningful, it doesn't give full freedom, but it provides some room for fear guided movements and suspicion ridden actions. You can still have some spontaneity, but totalitarianism is different. By pressing men against each other, total terror destroys the space between them. Compared to the condition with its iron band, even the desert of tyranny, insofar as it's still some kind of space, appears like a guarantee of freedom. And so this is really what she means by the essence or the nature of totalitarianism. The switch from lawfulness to lawlessness back to lawfulness, but lawfulness now not as a government of laws, as hedges, but lawfulness as a using terror to fully actualize the laws of a movement, and thus the complete unification of a plurality of people into one under the band of terror. So anyway, these are some, as I was saying, these are some of the drafts that she's working on around this period, which go into her understanding of the epilogue and the idea of ideology, terror, lawfulness, lawlessness, loneliness, etc. I just thought it might be interesting and helpful to read some of these drafts, see her thought process as she's trying to figure it out. But really, at this point, I'm open to having you ask about these particular texts, or about the epilogue, or about the origins in general, and see if we can make sense more generally about what she's up to. All right. Look forward to the discussion. John Holt, you're up. John, I mean, you need to unmute yourself, John.
Sorry.
Yeah.
She says that the totalitarianism is a radical denial of freedom.
Yeah.
And so therefore, it would follow that the value of freedom must be somehow at the essence of being human. That seems to me what she is either saying or implying.
Yeah.
A new definition of human being as being radically free. All right. If that's the case, then if totalitarianism is based on fear, it seems to follow that fear would be the fear of freedom, of being free.
So
Because
totalitarianism is not based on fear. Tyranny is based on fear. The actual principle of tyranny is fear.
okay,
The actuating principle of totalitarianism is terror.
okay, okay. All right. I'll go with that.
But just to answer the first part of your question, on page 135, right?
Yeah.
She defines exactly what your first part is absolutely right. She says, uh she says, maybe we are confronted with the very realistic attempt at total domination, which is nothing else but the attempt at robbing man of his very nature, can no longer afford the cold courage of Montesquieu's fear. To us, it looks like the boldness of youth, which will risk in imagination everything, because nothing as yet has happened to fill in with concrete experience the forms of pure radical thought. But if we have a chance to save anything from the conflagration in which we are caught, then certainly only those essentials which are even more basic than the fundaments of law and the texture of tradition and morality which is woven around them. These essentials can be no more than that freedom is the quintessence of the human condition, and that justice is the quintessence of man's social condition. Or, in other words, that freedom is the essence of the human individual, and justice is the essence of men's living together, and that both can disappear from the earth only with the physical disappearance of the human race. So she is saying here that freedom is the essence of the human condition, not of human nature, we should say, but of the human condition. Remember, it's an important distinction that she'll make in the human condition. Um, and that justice is the quintessence of living together, or of in a sense politics, and that as long as there are human beings on the world, you will still have the possibility of freedom and justice. And she says, in the age of totalitarianism, that may be what we have to try and salvage. It may be that we can no longer salvage, as she says, um, uh, morality, right? It may be that we can no longer salvage some of these other values, law, for example, tradition, morality, which are things she quite likes, but maybe uh, hard to salvage right now. But at the very least, she thinks we have to strive to struggle to salvage freedom and justice in this sense. Yeah, is that? I don't know if that's going to where you were going, John, or not.
Well, where I'm going, when you said, what is the appeal of totalitarianism? And it seemed to me that the appeal is that we fear loneliness, and that totalitarianism gives us a kind of an ersatz community that we're unable to find in the liberal democracy in which we live. So
right.
there's that fear of loneliness. Just one more thought, that what may have brought this about is the connection between Darwin and Marx and totalitarianism is scientific laws being applied to human behavior and human action, which we call scientism, which is being challenged today by descendants of B.F. Skinner, for example, the radical denial of freedom, that everything is determined by an unbreakable chain of cause and effect, which is a horror to Arendt's understanding because of her essential focus on the needs for beginning, and that everything can be begun anew, both in the individual and in human societies, and that if we lose that, we lose our humanity. Um, that's all. Just, I'm
That's
still.
all right. That's all right. And her suspicion of science and knowledge, and her, there's a whole lot in this essay about why psychology and sociology and sciences will not lead to understanding of totalitarianism.
Yeah, they're inadequate to that. It requires imagination and the faculty of imagination, and she makes a big point of the faculty of imagination, that science simply cannot grasp, nor can science grasp or deal with the concept of values, lived values, and values that are motivated by the metaphor we have of the human heart, and that we are praying with Solomon for an understanding heart. Okay, that's enough. I've expressed myself enough.
All good. No, it's absolutely all important. Thank you very much, John. George, you're up.
Just three quick points that you may want to speak about the scientism business. I'm sort of surprised because sort of nowadays in cognitive thinking, things of that sort, scientism is really not a problem. It's usually we go ecological rationality and all that kind of business, but that I'll leave for another time. This time, just thinking about freedom and Montesquieu, Judith Shklar comes to mind. I mean, I don't know who was first with this, whether it was Shklar or Arendt, but you may want to comment on that, Roger, because I think it's an interesting comparison. The third thing is, and this is I'll go into later, she's been accused of excess universalism. And that's another thing you may want to discuss at one time. And finally, with the loneliness, when you think about the Holocaust situation, it's more the fear of loneliness that's a problem rather than loneliness itself. That is, people would join crowds in order to get killed because they felt more afraid of being lonely. That's it.
Okay. I don't understand the universalist question or excess universalism question. So I don't know if you want to come back
It's
to
really a question of context. It's a question of that Arendt, speaking about using context and not using a scientist type of thing, takes her own context of a German Jew who left before really the Holocaust occurred, and is pontificating, not pontificating, but is really saying things about what's going on and what went on without having been there. So it's really she's universalizing her own experience into, and this when we talk about Eichmann, we may want to speak about that, but what happened with the Judenrats, etc. So that's what I meant by that.
yeah. Okay. Um, yeah, I'm not sure I have much to say about that. Uh, what was the last? I'm sorry, George. The last point I was going to say something
The
to, but I
last
forgot.
point was not loneliness, but fear of loneliness.
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't, fear of loneliness. I don't know why it's important to call it fear. I mean, I think maybe. I mean, I'm not sure. The only reason this matters is so insofar as you accept the Montesquieuian idea that um uh fear is the motivating action of tyranny, whereas um for Arendt in totalitarianism it's going to be a kind of uh terror that sort of pushes us and motivates us. Um, uh, so, um, you know, the terror of loneliness and um, uh, the terror that then binds us together into a movement, into a logical movement, um, is going to be sort of the principle or action of loneliness of totalitarianism for her. Um, you know, to some
Yeah,
degree, this is an attempt to fit her reading into a framework that she takes from Montesquieu, and whether or not it's necessary or so meaningful, I don't know. Um,
yeah. Yeah, the thing that I was going at really is, let's say, from Tadeusz Borowski's story, where in the line to go to the crematorium at Auschwitz, somebody loses their glasses and goes crazy trying to pick it up because they're afraid that they're going to fall behind the rest of the crowd going to the crematorium. Or in an Ida Fink story where there's somebody who's hiding while they're doing an action and then sees the whole crowd being rounded up and goes out of hiding in order to join the crowd that's going to get killed. So that's what I mean by fear of loneliness.
Yeah. I mean, again, I don't think, I mean, like, all I can tell you is that's not how she's going to think about it. For her, the motivating principle of action for totalitarianism is the idea that on the foundation of loneliness, right, we are caught up in and susceptible to movements which not out of, but actually out of almost the opposite, a sense of of incredible power, in the far as that we come to see the power of logic, and we want to have the logic of the movement, the law of the movement, impose itself and spread itself over the world, so that we are confirmed in the meaning and purpose of the movement which we now embrace. And we do that through subjecting ourselves and others to terror, to fully conform ourselves to the law of these ideological movements. That's not fear. That's actually power, or that's a sense of logical, of logical certainty, and that's what she thinks is the sort of animating principle of totalitarianism, not fear. I mean, so, again, if you want to think of it as fear of loneliness that leads us to that, I don't, there's a way in which that makes some sense to me. But fear doesn't lead us to embrace the fundamental totalitarianism of movements. That's a kind of deep need to for power, and what she calls the lust for power. Very different from fear, I think, in her understanding and my understanding. Okay, Joanne.
Hi. I wanted to say, first of all, that I agree with what George said, and was thinking about that myself, that seems to be a strong inclination in her thinking to generalize. And it's unusual because she talks a lot about history, but I don't think that she spends enough time on the details of history. And I've thought this before too. She seems to cherry pick certain points in history and talk about them a lot. But anyway, that's not my main point here. My main point is, in light of the fact that this is Black History Month, I was wondering if we could take some of her analysis of either tyranny or totalitarianism and talk about the enslavement of Africans in this country. I think it's important, and it's important to be responsible and to try and use some of this in ways that can help us understand American society and not just European society in general. So I was just wondering, Roger, would you define the enslavement and the continuation into the conditions of slavery by slave owners and by the whole government of the United States as a form of totalitarianism, because that forces us then to look at the population. The population is not some mass that is more or less alike. It's distinguished in some pretty extreme ways. So I was just wondering if this analysis of totalitarianism can be useful in understanding American history.
I think it can be at times. You know, so I mean, I think we've talked about this a fair bit, both around earlier in this book, but also in other books. But you know, I think that you have to probably periodicize it a bit. But certainly you know, it's hard to know exactly when it begins, but probably in the mid 19th century and then through Jim and Jane Crow up until the you know, I don't know, 20s or 30s or 40s or 50s or 60s, depending on how you think about it. You created a racist ideology in the United States that was at least in parts of the country totalitarian. I think, yeah, used terror to impose a racial ideology on its people. I think that probably only emerged later than slavery emerged, and much of it actually came to its fulfillment after the formal abolition of slavery in Jane and Jim Crow. But yes, I think there was definitely. I mean, I don't know if it's. I mean, the difference is that it wasn't a full country, which is not to say that nothing bad happened in the North. Of course, it did, and also that it's not clear that it was imperialist or global in its ambitions in the way that she understands totalitarianism to be. And so one would have to you know, look at it within those caveats, at least those, can maybe others as well. But clearly racism as an ideological movement that used terror to impose itself on a population was part of the American history. Although, again, it's not clear how much it terrorized white people. In fact, and it's not clear that it was random in its way of total domination that she imagines totalitarianism to be. All of which, as I'm trying to think it through, I mean, you know, I this is on the fly, so I don't know. Suggest that it may have been less totalitarianism and more a kind of brutal tyranny or aristocracy of some sort.
That's what I was wondering also.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't really thought about it in those questions, Joanne. So, you know, it's a good exercise. And, if we really wanted to do it, we'd have to sit down and be a little bit more specific. And I'm not going to be able to do it,
Yeah.
in the middle of this without some more time and thought. But at least there's some questions that I think if you were interested, you'd want to pursue.
Thank you.
Yep. Ken.
Hi, thanks. What I've been thinking about is almost the complement to talking about the totalitarian movement, which is basically the drift of the whole book towards the inhuman. Like, I'm thinking that if you charted this book, there's all these places where it starts human and then it declines to the inhuman. And when it gets to totalitarianism, it just drops off a cliff, like over and over again, like from something solid to something destructive and then off the cliff. And to understand it, I made a chart of all the points we've been talking about, because I always feel like also in our discussions, we take one point like loneliness, which is important, but it's just a small part of the picture she's making. So what I was trying to do by making a chart is to see the broader picture of the book and that decline. And I just wanted to offer I'm not going to take up the group's time with it, but if anyone is interested in it, email me at ken@rlandau@gmail, put it in the chat. But here's my chart. But it covers, like, loneliness is part of it. There's a lot of questions. One is freedom, isolation, loneliness, homelessness, joblessness. These are all things we talked about. The rights of man. What happens to thought? It goes from meaningfulness to meaninglessness, and then turns around again into ideological supersense, and then disappears into self-sacrificing fanaticism. What happens to our thoughts, from ideas to indifference, common sense from being reality-based to upside down to complete contempt for utilitarian motives. What happens to people, from plurality to uniformity, through like masses and mobs to all one man of giant dimensions. And then the last part is government that I put in the chart. So anyway, if anyone is interested in it, it's of course really imperfect and broad. I'm trying to put a 500-page book onto 2 pages, but it might be interesting for discussion. That's it.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, trying to summarize the whole book in a couple minutes or in a chart is difficult, or anything, but it doesn't mean it's not worth the effort to try. It's a good exercise. And I think all of you could try to do what Ken's trying to do. And there are certainly major concepts in the book, that some of which Ken just mentioned, that are worth trying to think through throughout the book. So it's a great idea. Thank you.
Can I say one more thing? Can I say one more thing quickly? Yeah. So just that I also have the idea that we could sort of plot where we are, like, because we also fall into, like, is it totalitarian or is it not? Like, it's kind of useless. But if we're saying like joblessness is high right now, we can sort of take the temperature of where we are and drifting towards that inhuman. That was also my hope in doing it.
Thank you. Is that, I think that's Vigdis, although I can't really tell.
Oh, yeah, it is. I see it's my kind from the university. That's who I am there is shortened. I want to say something about understanding what she says. And I'm reading her in this Essays in Understanding. So this is from the essay Understanding in Politics, or Difficulties in Understanding. And there she says on page 311, true understanding always returns to the judgments and prejudices which preceded and guided the strictly scientific inquiry. The sciences can illuminate, but neither prove nor disprove the uncritical preliminary understanding from which they start. If the scientists misguided by the very labor of his inquiry, begins to pose as an expert in politics and to despise the popular understanding from which he started, he loses immediately the Ariadne thread of common sense, which alone will guide him securely through the labyrinth of his own results. And this reminds me very much of one thing that I'm very concerned with in her thinking, and which she repeats in this Hannah Arendt on Hannah Arendt, in this conference, she said, and that is, what is the subject of our thought? Experience, nothing else. And if we lose the ground of experience, then we get into all kinds of theories. And I think it's interesting that what she says about starting from this kind of preliminary understanding and the prejudices what precedes. And she also says on the next page, popular language as it expresses preliminary understanding, thus starts the process of true understanding. So I think, and this goes to stick to the fact, it also goes to this, as you said, about which is a comprehension is to facing up to the reality and resisting it or something like that. It is this kind of seeing what's going on and trying to identify what's going on in the world we live. And to me, it has been, this is the first time I read this book. And to me, it's always interesting to read Arendt, as I see her as a source for understanding and coming to terms with the world I live in. So, and she also says this, that the result of understanding is meaning, which we originate in the very process of living, insofar as we try to reconcile ourselves to what we do and what we suffer. And then in her Denktage book, she kind of goes on to that, and understanding creates depth. You goes into that in your introduction, not meaning. Politically, this is the same as becoming, making oneself at home in the world. And to me, this is the way I read Arendt. I always read to try to understand the world I live in, and this to try to kind of to see what's going on and to start from the world we live in. And I end with this kind of, when she talks about this, the totalitarian interpretation, all laws become laws of movement. And it struck me that today, if you think about it, the one law that seems to go through every kind of country and every state in the world is the law of economic growth expressed in GDP, which always must increase from time to time. It's interesting to think about that. And it's driven by competition. So yeah, that was just some comments to that. I'm going to change back to my real name.
No, that's really, that's very interesting. And, you know, I think there's something to that last comment you made that's important is, you know, if the, you know, if the movement of communism or Marxism or Bolshevism is, you know, the elevation of the proletariat and the class warfare against the bourgeoisie, and if the movement of anti-Semitism is, you know, the destruction of the Jews and the elevation of the Aryans, and movement of racism is white supremacy, and that totalitarianism is the embrace of a logical movement in which we impose these laws on the world through terror and seek to unify the world in that regard. Growth, right? Economic growth does seem to be one of these fundamental premises that we embrace in its unforgiving logic. And you know, one could imagine economic growth as an ideology, as a movement that we have as a fundamental assumption of our time. It's an interesting thought. I mean, I think it there's something right about it. I'd have to think more about it. Whether to think of it as a proto-totalitarian movement or not. But it could easily be thought that way. So thank you.
There was an economist, I don't remember his name, who said that today it's easier for people to imagine. I mean, it's more difficult for people to imagine the end of capitalism than the end of the world. And that's what worries me, because even if we see the climate problems we have and the kind of killing all the nature around us and every living thing on our planet, it seems that this kind of logic of the economic growth overwins everything. We don't get out of it, even if there's threats. And in the end, it will be destruction of every living thing on this planet. So yeah, that's in a way what I fear with this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think there is a kind of ideology of growth. It goes along with an ideology of progress, right? That Arendt is very critical of and writes about throughout her career. And both of the, but I don't know if they're totalitarian, I guess would be the sort of caveat. To the extent that terror is mobilized in either the name of progress or growth, but they are ideologies, and they are deeply powerful ideologies that we begin with logical premises and we draw them to the conclusion, and it's very hard to resist them today. So I think you're absolutely right. Gilbert.
Yes, please. Thank you. Please, you, based on your statement, where you mentioned that one cannot fight totalitarian leader rather than understand him. In that context, I would like this following question. We all know that in different countries, there are existing of totalitarian regime. So when people are aware of that totalitarianism, and when people understand well enough that totalitarianism, while suffering in silence, what do you think can be done in order to transform that understanding into process of solving that kind of dictatorship? Thank you.
It's a good question. I think that the first few things to say are, it is amazing how flexible human beings are. Man, this flexible being, is a quotation she offers, I guess in this case from Montesquieu. Dostoevsky says much the same thing in his Notes from the Underground, that we are an incredibly flexible being who can pretty much teach ourselves or convince ourselves to accept almost anything. We bend ourselves in society to the thoughts and impressions of others, Montesquieu says. And so it is hard to convince people to resist totalitarianism. Why are so many people in, I mean, we can pick many countries, but in Russia today, unwilling, unable, uninterested in resisting a government that many of them know is wrong, and is totalitarian or close to it, if not totalitarian. And part of it is, well, cynicism. They're all politics is pretty evil, right? I mean, this is the new Trump version, right? The United States is just as bad. So why not just go with the people you know, the devil you know? The moral, the loss of a moral framework from which to judge is part of it. That there's simply no strong sense of morality left with which to judge these regimes. And so her argument is that if you want to resist totalitarianism, you resist it because it's taking away your freedom, and that freedom is the quintessence of the human condition. I think she thinks that's the way to resist it. I don't know if she has another. Then comprehending or understanding can also offer paths of resistance in a different sense, which is that if you understand its appeal, you can free yourselves from it. But I think she thinks that understanding will never be a mass phenomena, right? I don't know. She doesn't say that exactly, but it's an unending struggle. It's not easy. It's constant self-analysis. I don't think understanding is going to be an avenue towards mass resistance. That doesn't mean it's not important for those who go down that path. But for most people, I think you have to somehow convince them of the danger of freedom. And part of the problem, Gilbert, then is that, as she says, even though there's not a lot of freedom in tyranny, there's still some, right? As long as you can still, in your apartment, read who you want to read and talk to who you want to talk to and do what you want to do, you have some freedom. And as a result, it's very hard to get to a government that is the full and radical rejection of all freedom. And so I think people are very good at convincing themselves. Then they can say, well, okay, I've lost some freedom, but I still have others, and that's good enough. I think it's easy from the outside to talk about how horrible it is to live under a dictatorship. And yet there are many people who live under dictatorships and live human lives, I think. And so what is going to make somebody who's able to live a human life under a dictatorship resist? And one answer is a worry that the small freedoms that they have left will be taken away. And another is that they want a fuller understanding of freedom, freedom to act powerfully, to govern themselves, to act in public, to gather with others. And it's that aspect of freedom that one has to appeal to, I think she says. But not everyone wants that. We have to at least acknowledge that. There's a Zoom user here, and it's a very small picture that I see on my screen. Can you tell me who that is?
I think that's me, Roger.
Bob. Yeah, okay. It's
Okay.
just you're so small in the picture, I couldn't see who it was.
Yeah, I'm not at the office, so this is my iPhone. But I'd like to key off a few things that were said and maybe tie them together or perhaps offer them as a challenge. I'm with Gilbert in the question of what is to be done. And regarding you, Roger, you said the magic word Trump. And so in my own particular case, you know, I'm in this on the one hand to understand Arendt, and on the other hand, to see how it illuminates what's going on. And for the most part, I think basically you can't understand Trump and Trumpians in terms of totalitarianism. I live amongst Trumpians, and they're not lonely. For the most part, they're normal people. And if we want to understand their support for Trump, at least for those maybe who watch some of this media that you know infects their minds, it's more like Ernst Nolde's three faces of fascism, where a major element was amongst the fascists of the 30s was anti-Bolshevism, and amongst the Trumpians, maybe even the majority, it's just a distaste for liberals and for Democrats and for woolly-headed do-gooders. On the other hand, again, you know, there are some elements that ring true. Trump's lust for power, you know, is just so incredible. And it may even exceed what, by comparison, Hitler's and Stalin's. I mean, they had an ideology. Trump doesn't have an ideology. He just wants power. And the people who follow him, you know, they can probably concede that. But again, it's, you know, the opposition or the other side that that inspires them against them. And there are many other aspects, some of which in totalitarianism maybe strikes a chord. But basically, Trump is something new. He's a nihilist who's managed to entertain, and Hitler was an entertainer too. Stalin wasn't. Who's managed to entertain a lot of people, and I think this combines, you know, my interest in understanding Arendt with my practical nature as a businessman to try and figure out what to do about it.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, I think a lot of what you said makes sense. I mean, I'll say this: I don't think we can know yet the answer to the question you're asking, right? Whether Trump would be a totalitarian or not. He wasn't in his first term in office. We don't know what he would be in the second, right? So on one level, you just don't know. He, you know, I think a lot of people who vote for him vote for him simply because they dislike Democrats, as you said, or don't like the direction the country's going, or think that the country is broken and that you need someone to break the broken institutions in order to fix it. And there's a lot of reasons I think people vote for Trump, which, you've mentioned some of them, which are not totalitarian. Um, and so, I think that these are all good points. To the extent there's an increasingly totalitarian aspect to some of his uh, his movement, which has always been a movement. It's this absolute divorce from reality, and his insistence that he can say almost anything and make it true. That is that desire, and at least with 30 to 40% of the country, ability to remake reality is a kind of proto-totalitarian aspect to his movement. Now, whether he would succeed in that, I think is unlikely, but you never know. Will he be able to undo the institutions that oppose that would he be able to take over the institutions, whether it be the media or the courts or corporations, in such a way to totalize his coherently fictional account of reality? I find it unlikely, but I don't think it's impossible anymore. I think it's the way in which he has continually insisted on his version of reality, and convinced so many people of it. What would happen if he starts putting media people or suing them or arresting them? Now, there's still a court system that would protect them, but it takes time. I don't know. All I'm saying is, I think at this point, it's hard to know. He was limited in the first term by a lot of Republicans who tried to control him, and he seems to have liberated himself from that. I think that there's still there's a lot of people in Congress and in the courts who are Republicans who don't like Trump and would try and resist him, but they've had a very poor record of doing so. And what happens, I don't know. So I don't think you can say it yet. I think you can say that there are parts of Trump that of his movement that are non-totalitarian, and there are parts of his movement that are totalitarian. And, that's dangerous, but I don't know what's going to happen. I can't tell you if he's elected. Nico.
Hi there. I just wanted to reflect on the comments you made about progress, and whether progress is an ideology. And I've been commenting in the chat that it seems to me the modern ideology is anti-growth and environmentalism stroke kind of climate change. Obviously, climate change isn't a thing. I mean, it's a thing, but it's like anti-Semitism, anti-climate change action. And it seems to me I wouldn't say it's totalitarian in the way that we're talking about it, but it seems to be unthinking in that it doesn't brook arguments and it doesn't really engage in facts, though it does claim scientific validity, although rarely can anyone actually cite any scientific papers which back it up. There's
You talking about
discussion about what scientism is as well. That's a side point. But it seems to me that very few people believe in progress in any sense today, and everybody sees limits to growth and growth as being a problem. But I was particularly interested in Arendt's critique of progress, because it doesn't seem to be one which understands the need for increased wealth in order for people to be liberated from the constraints of nature. And I wondered if that's something I'd missed in her writing. I mean, her focus seems to be very much on the challenges of growth for authenticity and, oh, sorry, progress for authenticity and a kind of sense of meaning and so on. But maybe I've misunderstood what her critique is.
Well, I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, yes, there's a lot of people who are anti-growth today, but even that movement, I think, is structured or presented as an attempt to progress, is to make the world better. I think there's a general, I mean, I think it's almost a universal belief that we can improve things, and that and that it's important to act to make the world better. Now, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. But this idea of progress has been an article of faith, certainly since the Enlightenment.
Mm.
And you know, it lies behind the entire idea of government, administration, bureaucracy, education, etc. Maybe I'm missing your critique or your skepticism around it.
Well, Roger, if I could just briefly just connect back to your introduction. So the goal of environmentalism and climate change is saving the planet, which seems to me an interesting abstraction, because it's not. So we've talked about the way in which totalitarianism takes either nature or history as these sort of universal totalizing dynamics, but environmentalism doesn't even talk about humanity, at least not directly. It's sort of bad faith, and it talks about saving the planet as if a saved planet would be sufficient even if humanity didn't exist any longer.
Yeah,
so that seems to me even
that's what
stranger.
environmentalism says.
Yeah, but it doesn't talk about humanity, and thus it can actually sacrifice humanity or human interests for the planet.
That's the point, Nico.
But
like, if you're a radical environmentalist, right? You're committed to the extinction of mankind.
Okay.
I mean, I don't see how that's a controversial statement.
Okay, well, I don't see that dialogue in public life. I mean,
no, but I mean, but there aren't that many. I mean, how many radical environmentalists are there? Very few. I mean, you know, I think it's, that would, if you were to really take environmentalism to its full logic, right? You would want to extinguish at least civilization. Maybe, you could keep a couple of, some humans alive, but you want, because civilization is one of the greatest threats to, a kind of, at least one version of environmentalism, of, of saving all species on the planet, in some sort of stasis. So, and there have been a few splinter movements of environmentalists who've sort of, moved in that direction, but they're not very popular. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. I mean, so yeah, I mean, I think there are ways in which you can imagine a totalitarian environmentalist movement, but it hasn't really caught the fancy of most people because most people don't want to extinguish mankind. Whereas totalitarian movements for anti-colonialism or racism or anti-Semitism or Bolshevism have been successful in seducing large numbers of people to their movements over time. Is that, I'm not sure, maybe I'm not understanding your question. But
Nico, you have to unmute yourself. You're muted, Nico.
I'm on another device as well, actually, so I'm not muted, but
okay. So in any case, I thank you for the conversation. We're going to bring the origins of totalitarianism to a close, and I'm very excited. It was a great conversation over the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 months, and thank you guys for all engaging in it. As you know, it's available both online and on now a podcast if you want to revisit any of the discussions. We begin next week, I'm very excited to say, with Eichmann in Jerusalem. We're gonna, if you need to order a copy of the book, order the Penguin edition, the new Penguin edition. And the reading schedule is on our website and will be sent out in emails. So thank you all very much and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. And we'll see you next week for Eichmann in Jerusalem. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a
Ciao,
lot.
Bye.
Dankeschön.
Bye. It was great seeing you guys. Take care.
Lo
Bye
mismo.
bye.
Gracias, Professor Roger.
You
Gracias.